Здравствуйте всем, меня зовут Jared, и я делаю русский язык легким. Hey everybody, my name is Jared, and I make the Russian language easy. Today I want to talk to you about one of the cultural differences that the Russian language has that English doesn't. And that is what they call, when they're teaching it in school, the formal and the informal. Now, this is not the formal sense in that, you're going out to a fancy dinner and you got to get all dressed up. It's not that kind of formal. It's more a formal in regards to respect. And it's not a heavy emphasis on respect. Think of it like this. If you ran across a third grader and his teacher was Miss Carol, that was my first grade teacher, but let's just say Miss Carol, and he started calling Miss Carol Stacy, that would be kind of a break of a cultural norm, right? You'd be like, hey, you really should talk to your teacher with Miss, Mr. sort of thing. It's that same way in Russian. It's not a huge difference. It's not like one is better or towering over the other. It's just kind of more a sense of respect. It's more of a cultural norm. Now, grammatically, there are certain ways that you convey the formal form. We're going to talk about those at the very end of the video. First, I want to start out by talking about when you should use the formal form, when you don't need to use the formal form, and then there are some special nuances to the formal form that are, I don't know if it's just specific to Russian, but you find it in Russian, not in English. They're kind of interesting. I think you'll like it. Okay, so let's first start out of when you should use the formal form. You're always going to want to use the formal form with somebody who's older than you. Okay, so if you're a teenager talking to, an adult or something, you would address them on the formal form. If you've just met somebody for the first time and you don't really know what the proper etiquette is, you want to use the formal form. And then generally when you're at work, you're always going to refer to your coworkers on the formal form until you really get to know them, but it's more just kind of a formal setting, okay? All right, those are kind of the general when you do it. Now here's when you don't do it. If I'm a teenager, let's say I'm, an 18-year-old guy out there and I go to the club and I meet somebody and I'm interested and want to talk some more. You wouldn't be on the formal form with them. You're at the same age. You would both be on the informal form. Same with little kids. You always talk to little kids on the informal form. Now, in return, they should talk to you on the formal form because you're older. But think about this. Kids learn to speak language by what they hear. And if everyone's always talking to them on the informal, how are they supposed to learn the formal? So it's kind of forgiven if a little kid who's kind of learning how to speak addresses somebody on the informal. They know it's kind of cute and they didn't really mean it. They just don't know yet. I was living over in Russian-speaking Ukraine. I was in a city called Dnipropetrovsk. We had what we called a хозяйка, and that was our landlord. And our хозяйка would come over about once to every other week just to check up on us or clean the apartment, do whatever she wanted there. So we got to be fairly good friends, right? I was still, I want to say общаться, but that's how you say it in Russian. I was still communicating with her on the formal form. But then my birthday came around. She's like, oh my gosh, I want to make you this tort, this cake for your birthday. I think you'll love it. And I was like, oh, that's very nice. So she came over. She brought her daughter over. I thought that was really nice. So I started talking with her on the informal form. And we just went throughout the day not the day, but the hour there, celebrated my birthday, had a really good time. She left. A couple of days later, I ran into her daughter on the street and I said, hey, how are you doing? And she said, Jared, I have to tell you, my mom was so offended that you started talking to her on the informal form. And I felt so bad. I was like, I'm sorry. I just thought that we'd become close enough friends that was okay. And she says, she's like, you're friends, but she is still your хозяйка, your landlord, and she is your elder. She was quite a bit older than me, probably by about 20 years or so. And so I was like, okay. It was just an innocent mistake, and I think she got it. They know that foreigners, it's not their native language, and obviously she went there out the whole day, but I just felt bad. There was another time when I was at the rynek. It's like their farmers markets, but that's where they buy most of their produce there. These two ladies, this lady wanted a kilogram risa. She wanted a kilogram of rice. And so I don't know how they do it. When I was there, they would literally put a bag, pour the rice in, and then it would, weigh out, and you'd watch the scale go and you'd see the kilogram of rice. Well, sometimes people were known to put their fingers under there and kind of adjust the scale a little bit. And this one lady who was buying the rice was accusing the seller of doing that. And they kind of got in this little spat. And initially they were talking on the formal form. And then all of a sudden the lady who was selling the rice went to the informal form as kind of a little bit of a slight. And the other lady responded, she's like, don't you talk to me on the informal form. And they kind of had this little spat about what was the appropriate etiquette conversation there. And from a foreigner standpoint, I thought that was interesting. I'd never really heard anyone get into a spat. So what do you do if you're on the formal form and you feel like it's time or it's appropriate to go over to the informal form? One way you can know is I always let them lead. If they, as the native speaker, started talking to me on the informal form, and there wasn't a big age difference, right? You know, if you've got an old babushka out there, an old grandma, and she's just going to talk to you on the informal form from day one because she's old and she can do whatever she wants, right? I always talk to them on the formal. But if you're just in a daily, you know, a casual conversation and a few minutes into it or an hour into it, depending on when, they just start talking to you on the informal, you can go to the informal as well. That's kind of a unwritten rule there. If you're not sure or they're not sure, there's a couple different words you can use and you can just outright ask them. And I will put these words in the show note, but you can say, "Давайте переходим на ты." So let's cross over to ты. And that's just kind of a formal way of saying, hey, let's switch over to ты. And it's kind of like, hey, are you good if we kind of get a little more, and it's not really informal, but just make it a little more casual. Maybe that's a better word, casual. And usually people will be okay with that at point. If they're not, if they're like, then you know that they're not comfortable with it. You're just like, no, ничего тогда. Just like, oh, no big deal then. You know, you just go back and carry on your conversation. There's another word, обращаться, and that means, that's the word I was using earlier that I couldn't remember. And it just means to communicate on or to convey with. I don't ever remember asking somebody like, hey, let's, you know, давайте обращаемся на ты. I don't remember ever saying that. I don't think you would say that. But when discussing a conversation or something, мы обращались на ты or something, you could say, hey, we were on the informal form or something like that. That's more when that verb is used. So I'm going to put that down in the show notes as well. One way you delineate if you're on the formal or informal is by the word you. If you've seen my other video on personal pronouns, and I'll link that down below, but you know they have two ways of saying you. They have ты, which is the informal form, and they have вы, which is the which is the formal form. They both mean you, but one is informal and one is formal. Ты, informal, вы, formal. They have a verb, тыкать. Okay, so он тыкал, you know, he was talking on ты. He was, and you say on in Russian is how you say you were talking on ты, which means, you know, he was addressing me with the informal form or the casual form. I thought that was kind of just a little interesting word in the Russian language. I'll put that word in the show notes as well. Okay, and then the only other thing to know about the formal and the informal is the formal form is also the plural form, always. So if we go back to that ты and вы, let's say with my friends, I say, hey, what are you reading? I would use the, hey, что ты читаешь? I'd use the ты form. But if a group of my friends, let's say they were all reading one book and were discussing it, I would say, что вы читаете? What are you? So I'd use the вы because that's the plural. I'm not asking one person. I'm asking the group. What are they reading? Okay, there's a couple different instances where you're going to see the formal and the informal form. The first one I already talked about, and that's the two yous, right? The ты and the вы. We already discussed that. There's the formal and the informal you. And you use you all the time in conversations, so you need to, you know which one you're using. The next kind of comes in greetings. When you want to say hello to someone, you can say здравствуйте. That's kind of the formal form of saying hello. And because it's formal, it's also the plural. Здравствуйте. That's what you would say to a babushka. That's what you'd say to your boss. But, you know, if a little kid came up to you, you wouldn't say здравствуйте. There's a much informal or casual, I like that word better. There's a much more casual way of saying, you say привет. Okay, привет. And that's just like, hey, or hi. Now, you would never say привет to the babushka. You know, that would be disrespectful. Okay, so you get that in your greetings. And there's a few other little greetings here, which I'm not going to go into now because this is not a greetings video. But just know that that's kind of one other area where you see it a lot. The other area where you see it is in the imperative forms of verbs. I know, grammar term there for you. Basically, what it is when you're telling somebody to do something. there are two different ways you can read it. Take the verb читать. Okay, that's to read. You know, if I wanted to ask my friend, hey, read me this book, I would say, читай мне эту книгу. But if I was asking, you know, somebody that I don't know on the street or a babushka, I would say, читайте мне, пожалуйста. So do you hear the difference? Читай, singular, informal. Читаете, formal, plural. Now, how you form those with verbs, that's a whole separate video. We're not going to get into it right now, but I just want you to know that. Okay, so there's kind of the three areas. The you, ты and вы, the greetings, привет, здравствуйте, and then the command form, the imperative form on verbs. There is the formal and informal, and we'll address that in a future video. Speaking of which, you should subscribe to my channel because I've got a lot more good content coming up. Okay, you guys, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but if not, if you have questions, leave those in the comments below, and I will go ahead and answer them for you. Ну хорошо тогда, это все. Спасибо и увидимся.